When I first spotted the Lakehouse, it felt like stepping into another era, a place frozen in time, yet pulsing with life. If a house could breathe, this one surely did. It was perched on the edge of a crystal-clear lake, its wooden exterior weathered by decades of sun, wind, and rain, and yet somehow still standing strong. Its paint was peeling in places, revealing layers of history underneath. Every creak of the floorboards, the way the shutters rattled gently in the wind, seemed to whisper secrets of those who had lived there before. I felt an inexplicable connection, as if this house had been waiting for me. I had been searching for months for something different, something with character, something that didn't smell like cookie-cutter newness and antiseptic walls. When I saw this place, my heart leapt. The real estate agent had hesitated a little when she brought me here, muttering something about the neighbors being particular and the old deeds being complicated, but I brushed it off. I was determined to own a piece of history, not a glossy photo in a magazine. I was ready for the charm, the quirks, the inevitable repairs, because this was more than a house. It was a legacy. As I stepped inside the front door, the smell of aged wood and earth filled my senses. I could almost hear echoes of laughter, children running down the halls, footsteps on the creaking stairs, voices from the past whispering memories. I imagined myself restoring the antique furniture, polishing the floors, repainting the walls while preserving their aged beauty. I pictured summer evenings on the deck with friends, fishing in the lake, and mornings sipping coffee as mist rolled over the water. Everything about this property felt right, as if destiny itself had guided me here. However, perfection rarely comes without a price. I soon discovered that my idyllic sanctuary came with a set of challenges I hadn't anticipated. I noticed a pristine HOA sign at the entrance to the neighboring community, a gleaming badge of suburban order that marked the beginning of a different kind of world, one governed by rules and regulations rather than charm and history. Their lawns were perfectly manicured, their flower beds symmetrical, and their houses gleaming with fresh paint and polished windows. At the center of it all was Karen, the self-appointed queen of compliance, a woman whose reputation for nitpicking had spread throughout the county. At first, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't planning to interfere with the HOA. I had purchased a lake house to escape, not to become embroiled in suburban drama. But Karen had a way of noticing newcomers, especially those daring enough to live next to her perfect little world. She was vigilant, precise, and utterly unrelenting, and I soon found out she had set her sights on me. The first warning came in the form of a letter on official HOA letterhead. It was neatly typed and referenced some obscure violation code 47B. Apparently, my old wooden dock did not meet aesthetic standards, and my mailbox was inconsistent with neighborhood rules. I laughed at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding, but that laughter quickly faded when a second letter arrived, demanding immediate removal of the dock or facing legal consequences. I tried to reason with myself. Perhaps it was just bureaucracy, or maybe a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew I was dealing with something far more personal. Karen's energy was focused and targeted, her gaze sharp, her smile tight and condescending. When I finally confronted her at the HOA office, it was clear this was not a simple complaint. This was war. She held her clipboard like a shield and a sword combined and launched into a monologue about regulations, safety, and property aesthetics, with a fervor that made it obvious she relished the power she wielded. She looked me up and down with thin-lipped disdain and said, "We can resolve this peacefully or not. The choice is yours." I tried to remain calm and polite, explaining that the dock had been part of the property for decades, that the house was grandfathered in, and that I owned the land I had purchased legally. But Karen was having none of it. Her posture was rigid, her voice sharp, and filled with authority that left no room for negotiation. I left the office that day with a stack of letters and a sense that this was only the beginning of what would become a relentless campaign to intimidate and control. Back at the lake house, I walked along the shoreline, reflecting on what I had just experienced. The water lapped gently against the wooden posts of the dock. The breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and I realized that this house had given me more than just a property. It had given me a purpose, a challenge that went beyond restoration, beyond serenity. It was about standing my ground, defending my rights, and protecting the place I had come to love from someone who saw control and compliance as more important than decency or neighborly respect. That night, I sat by the fireplace, surrounded by boxes and old furniture, imagining the confrontation to come. The flickering flames reflected in the aged glass of the windows, and I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was not going to be easy. Karen was formidable, meticulous, and relentless. Yet I felt a surge of determination. I had done my research on the property. Every deed, every survey, every map had been checked and double-checked. I knew I was in the right. The battle lines had been drawn, the stage was set, and I was ready to defend my lake house with everything I had. The sun rose the next morning, casting golden light over the lake and illuminating the cracks and imperfections of the century-old house. Instead of seeing flaws, I saw character. I saw resilience. I saw home. I knew that this fight with Karen and the HOA would test my patience, my resolve, and my ingenuity. But I also knew that some things are worth defending, and that there's a satisfaction in standing firm against petty tyranny. Little did I know, at that moment, that the coming days would reveal a truth so shocking it would upend everything Karen thought she knew about authority and control, and that the lake house I had fallen in love with would become the battleground for a story of justice, revenge, and the ultimate triumph of right over arrogance. It didn't take long for Karen's obsession to escalate from petty letters to full-blown harassment. I started noticing her minivan parked strategically across the street, as if she were staking out my property. Every morning, it was there, a constant reminder that my peaceful retreat was being watched and judged. The first few days, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that this was simply an overzealous neighbor. But the letters kept coming, more detailed and aggressive each time, outlining supposed violations with a tone that was increasingly threatening. One morning, I stepped outside to find not just a letter, but an entire folder pinned to my front door. It was addressed in perfect block letters, warning me of legal consequences, fines, and forced removal of structures, such as my dock and even my mailbox. I stared at it in disbelief. My dock had been there for decades, and the mailbox matched the style of the house perfectly. Yet here was this tyrant trying to rewrite the rules of reality. I documented everything, taking photos of the folder, the letters, the minivan, and even signs of her inspection tours, everything that seemed like evidence of targeted intimidation. I called my lawyer, explaining the situation, and he chuckled, telling me he had seen plenty of HOA nonsense in his career, but nothing like this. He assured me that I was completely in the right, that the property was legally mine, and that Karen's threats were baseless. But the absurdity of it didn't make it any less stressful. The thought that someone could obsess so much over a neighbor that they would spend days documenting every little detail, looking for any excuse to punish or intimidate, was surreal. I realized quickly that Karen thrived on control and humiliation and had no concept of reason or fairness. The harassment grew bolder. With every passing day, I received more letters, sometimes slid under the door, sometimes left on the porch in the middle of the night. Each one warned me of safety violations, zoning complaints, and even claimed that my house was unfit for habitation according to some obscure code I had never heard of. I started keeping a log, notes on dates, times, contents, and even her gestures when I saw her outside, peering at my property from her perfectly trimmed hedge. It was exhausting, but I refused to let it go unnoticed. One evening, after receiving yet another threatening email, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spent hours poring over old land records, maps, and deeds in the county archives. I had always been meticulous about property boundaries, but now I wanted to see the history of this land, the surveys from 100 years ago, any note about easements or encroachments, anything that could give me leverage against this relentless campaign. What I discovered shocked me completely. According to the original plat maps and survey records, the property I had purchased extended far beyond the boundaries that Karen and the HOA assumed it did. The HOA itself, including all their perfectly maintained lawns, their community office, and even the roads winding through their neighborhood, sat entirely on land I legally owned. It was almost unbelievable, as if time and bureaucracy had conspired to hide the truth from everyone, including the HOA members themselves. I checked and double-checked, cross-referencing with tax assessor maps and current property records. It was undeniable. Every square foot of Karen's kingdom was technically on my property. I felt a rush of disbelief, followed by exhilaration. This was the ultimate power shift. I had endured weeks of harassment, intimidation, and ridiculous legal threats from a woman who thought she ruled the neighborhood. And now reality had completely flipped. I contacted my lawyer, sending him the documents, photos, and plats confirming the situation. He confirmed what I had suspected with a wide grin. This was far beyond petty revenge. It was a legal revelation with the potential to completely upend the HOA and their authority. The next few days were spent planning carefully. I knew I couldn't act rashly. Karen was sharp, calculating, and had no intention of backing down. I needed a strategy that would maximize impact while ensuring my rights were fully protected. I began preparing a formal presentation of the evidence, maps, surveys, and legal notes highlighting the fact that the HOA had been sitting on my land without permission for decades. Every document was meticulously annotated, every detail cross-referenced with current tax records. I wanted this to be undeniable. Meanwhile, Karen continued her routine of inspection drives, leaving letters and emails that grew increasingly desperate. I could almost hear the tension in her words. Each note an escalation of control in the face of a reality she was completely unaware of. She had no idea that her empire rested on land that was not hers, and that the very rules she tried to enforce so aggressively were now completely inapplicable. I also began documenting her and the HOA members walking and driving on the land, their signs, structures, and offices all technically trespassing without my consent. This evidence would not only protect me legally, but also expose the absurdity of the situation publicly if needed. I could imagine the faces of the board members when confronted with the reality that the carefully constructed world of compliance and order was, in fact, sitting entirely on someone else's property. Despite the mounting evidence, I also had to prepare mentally. Karen's reaction would be explosive. She thrived on control, humiliation, and authority. Her ego was built around her position in the neighborhood and would not allow her to admit fault easily. I anticipated arguments, protests, and attempts to manipulate the situation, but now I was armed with unassailable proof and a sense of quiet satisfaction that fueled my resolve. I was ready for the confrontation. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the emotional toll this situation had taken. I had bought a Lakehouse to escape stress, not to become embroiled in petty tyrannies. Yet here I was, navigating a legal maze, a battle of wills with a woman who had underestimated me completely. It was exhausting to juggle the research, documentation, letters, and planning, but each step brought me closer to reclaiming my peace and my property. Finally, the day came when I had all the documents, maps, and evidence ready. I could see the narrative clearly in my mind. The dramatic reveal, the undeniable proof that Karen and the HOA had built their world on someone else's land, the look on her face when she realized the truth. Every detail meticulously planned. It was a slow-building moment of justice that I knew would resonate beyond this neighborhood and teach a lesson about arrogance, entitlement, and the importance of respecting boundaries, both literal and figurative. As I looked out over the lake, the sun reflecting off the water, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and satisfaction. The conflict that had begun as petty letters and threats had transformed into something much larger, a battle for justice, for property rights, and for the sheer audacity of revealing the truth. I knew that the coming confrontation would change everything, and that the Lakehouse I had fallen in love with would become the stage for one of the most satisfying victories of my life. After days of careful planning, I decided it was time to confront Karen and the HOA in person. I sent a formal invitation to a community meeting, framing it as an opportunity to resolve the ongoing property disputes amicably. On the surface, it appeared perfectly polite, But underneath, I had meticulously arranged every detail to ensure the moment of truth would be undeniable. Karen arrived in her usual fashion, sharp and tailored, clipboard in hand, and a smug smile that clearly expected to intimidate me into submission. Her entourage of HOA members followed nervously, whispering among themselves as if they sensed the tension but didn't know why. I greeted her cordially, leading her and the board members onto the property, showing them the weathered charm of the Lakehouse, the wooden deck that had stood for a century, the carefully maintained lawn, and the serene view of the water. The sun reflected off the lake, highlighting the cracks and imperfections in the house, yet also illuminating its character and resilience. Karen nodded superficially, listening, but I could see the impatience in her eyes. She was ready to lecture, scold, and assert authority she thought she held here. Then I handed her the documents, the original plat maps, the surveyor notes, and the deed records, all painstakingly collected and verified. Each clearly showed that the HOA's land, roads, and office building were built entirely on my property. I watched her reaction carefully. At first, she blinked rapidly, as if the words on the pages didn't register. Then her eyes widened. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she finally spoke, and a sharp authority in her voice faltered. This can't be. These records are wrong. I remained calm, explaining each piece of evidence and showing how the original surveys and current tax maps aligned perfectly, proving my ownership. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice shaking as she attempted to assert control, but I let the documents do the talking. The board members leaned in, whispering among themselves, their faces a mixture of disbelief and shock. It was becoming clear to everyone present that the entire structure of control Karen had wielded for so long was based on an illusion. The atmosphere shifted dramatically as I calmly outlined the legal implications. I explained that any further attempts to evict me or claim violation of HOA rules would be entirely baseless. I further noted that the letters, threats, and inspections could now be considered harassment, given the circumstances. Continued trespassing on my land could have serious consequences. The murmurs grew louder, and Karen's hands shook slightly, clutching her clipboard as if it were a lifeline to the authority she had lost. I could see the panic spreading in her eyes as reality sank in. She had spent weeks trying to assert power over someone who was, in fact, the rightful owner of the land. Her arrogance had blinded her to the truth, and now the truth had arrived with undeniable force. There was no room for denial, argument, or deflection. The evidence spoke for itself, and every face in the room reflected the magnitude of this revelation. Karen tried to argue technicalities, suggesting that boundaries could be disputed. But I had anticipated this and came prepared with cross-references to county records, expert survey notes, and historical documentation. The more she tried to push back, the more impossible it became. Her arguments collapsed under the weight of irrefutable proof. It was a surreal moment, watching someone who had wielded authority so aggressively unravel in the face of facts she could not manipulate. The board members began asking questions, seeking clarification about their properties, roads, and rights. I explained patiently, showing the maps and pointing out precisely where the HOA structure sat in relation to my land. Karen's face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. She had underestimated me completely, and now everyone was witnessing her downfall. I could almost hear the silent gasp in the room, the realization that the woman they had followed for years was standing on property that wasn't hers. I gave Karen a choice: acknowledge the reality and work with me to rectify the boundaries, or continue with a legal battle that could dismantle the HOA entirely. She stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Every attempt to assert control was deflected by the undeniable facts. I watched the shift in power with a sense of satisfaction, not just because of the victory, but because of the justice inherent in the moment. Other HOA members were stunned, speechless, and some tried to interject questions about compensation, repairs, and boundary adjustments. I explained that while my goal was not vengeance, It was necessary to correct the records and ensure that my property rights were respected. Karen's silence spoke volumes. The smug confidence that had defined her presence evaporated, replaced by a mixture of fear, humiliation, and disbelief. In the days following the confrontation, the HOA had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Legal documents were updated, boundaries corrected, and a formal recognition of my property rights established. Karen was forced to step back, losing her authority and influence over the neighborhood. Her reputation was tarnished. She became a cautionary tale, a lesson in humility and respect for others' rights. The board members had to cooperate, acknowledging my ownership of the land and the absurdity of the previous harassment. Walking through the neighborhood for the first time since the confrontation, I felt a sense of liberation. The oppressive atmosphere that had been created by Karen's obsession lifted. The Lakehouse and surrounding land finally felt like my sanctuary. The air seemed fresher, the sunlight brighter, and even the lake seemed to glimmer in approval, as if recognizing the restoration of order and justice. It was not just a victory for me, but a lesson to anyone who might underestimate the power of facts, persistence, and rightful ownership. Looking back on the confrontation, I realized how much strategy, patience, and evidence had played into this outcome. Karen had underestimated me, and the truth had prevailed. The lake house that had begun as a dream had transformed into a symbol of justice, triumph, and the ultimate satisfaction of standing firm against unwarranted tyranny. The confrontation had been tense, emotional, and dramatic, yet necessary to restore balance and assert my rightful claim over the land. As I stood on the deck that evening, watching the sun set over the lake, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This battle had been won not through anger or aggression, but through careful preparation, clarity, and the courage to confront a relentless adversary. The lake house had survived a century of storms, and now it had survived Karen, the self-appointed queen of compliance, a woman who had finally learned that arrogance cannot withstand truth and that history and rightful ownership cannot be ignored. The confrontation was not just a personal victory. It was a message to the community and to anyone who would try to impose power without merit, that facts matter, that patience and research are weapons more powerful than intimidation, and that justice has a way of prevailing when the time is right. The lake house, my dream, was now secure, and the balance had been restored, leaving only the serene beauty of the lake, the sound of water, and the knowledge that the fight for what is right can yield a reward sweeter than any imagined. After the confrontation with Karen and the HOA, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. What had once been a place of tension and surveillance transformed into an environment where respect and reality finally took precedence. The HOA, which had once wielded authority like a weapon, was forced to acknowledge my legal ownership of the land and make adjustments that had been long overdue. It was surreal to watch the power that Karen had so meticulously cultivated crumble before irrefutable evidence and reason. Karen herself became a shadow of the figure she had once been. Her confidence evaporated, and the air of superiority she carried like armor was replaced by embarrassment and resentment. She continued to attend HOA meetings, but no longer led them. Her voice often faltered when she attempted to speak, and her authority was questioned by members who had witnessed her downfall. The community had seen the reversal firsthand. The new reality that their perfect little kingdom had been built entirely on someone else's property was undeniable, and it humiliated Karen beyond repair. I, on the other hand, felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not born from malice, but from justice being served. The lake house I had fallen in love with remained untouched by petty tyranny, and I finally had the peace I had dreamed of. The first thing I did was restore boundaries, clearly marking my property with tasteful signs and legal markers, ensuring that the situation could never repeat itself. I also documented everything meticulously, creating a permanent record of the encounter, the legal confirmations, and the corrected boundaries, so there could be no ambiguity for future residents or HOA members. With my property secured, I turned my attention to the lake house itself. The building, which had been a time capsule for a century, received the care and attention it deserved. I repaired the deck, reinforcing it while keeping the original wood and charm intact. I painted where necessary, using colors that honored the house's history, and polished the floors so that they shone without losing their antique character. I restored the antique furniture and decor, gradually bringing the house back to life while preserving the sense of history that had drawn me here in the first place. The lake itself became a place of pride and joy again. I cleared away debris, fixed the dock, and even invited respectful neighbors to enjoy certain sections under my supervision. The lake house was no longer just a home. It had become a symbol of patience, persistence, and the triumph of rightful ownership. Karen's attempts at intimidation had not only failed, but had created an opportunity to assert authority in a way that respected history and justice, rather than petty rules and personal vanity. The community slowly adjusted to the new reality. Some residents were shocked that their HOA's empire had been built on someone else's land. Others were relieved that the constant scrutiny and unrealistic rules had come to an end. The environment shifted from one of fear and judgment to cautious respect. I made it clear that while my ownership was absolute, I had no desire to punish anyone. I simply wanted boundaries honored and my property treated with the dignity it deserved. The balance had been restored. Karen, of course, did not take this quietly. Her attempts to regain influence were met with polite resistance from the board and subtle reminders of the evidence that had exposed her error. The humiliation was evident in her expressions, the way she walked through the neighborhood, and even in her interactions with neighbors who once feared her judgment. She had been dethroned in a way that was undeniable and permanent. Every attempt to reclaim her authority only highlighted the facts that had led to her fall. Beyond the immediate victory, I realized the confrontation had taught me more than legal savvy. It had shown me the power of preparation, patience, and documentation, that even the most aggressive or arrogant individuals can be neutralized with facts. The experience reinforced my belief that asserting one's rights respectfully yet firmly can yield incredible results, and that standing your ground against unwarranted control often leads to rewards beyond material gains. Even more, the lake house had gained a renewed sense of life. It was no longer just a dream or a relic of the past. It was a living testament to resilience and justice. I hosted small gatherings for friends and family, evenings by the lake filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of joy that comes from victory tempered with kindness. I took long walks along the shoreline, feeling the calm of the water and the gentle rustle of trees, knowing that nothing could disturb the peace I had fought so hard to protect. One morning, I noticed Karen watching from the edge of the HOA property, a silent observer, unsure of how to act now that her authority was gone. She didn't approach. Instead, she retreated slowly, as if acknowledging the reality she could not change. The once formidable queen of control had been reduced to a spectator of the very lake house she had attempted to dominate. The satisfaction of seeing her powerless without having to engage in hostility was profound and deeply rewarding. The final legal confirmations came a few weeks later. Boundaries were officially recognized, documents signed and notarized, and the HOA was required to pay reparations for the encroachments and disruptions caused by their decades-long occupation of my land. It was a complete reversal of fortune and a lesson in accountability and responsibility that resonated not just within the community, but within me personally. I realized that fighting for what is right, even when the challenge seemed daunting, can lead to outcomes that are fair, just, and deeply satisfying. As I sat on the restored deck one evening, watching the sunset over the lake, I reflected on the journey from the initial letters of harassment to this moment of triumph. The century-old lake house had endured storms before, and it had endured Karen. It had become a symbol of resilience and victory over petty tyranny. The air smelled of pine and water, and the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore reminded me that justice sometimes comes quietly, but powerfully. In the end, the story of the lake house became a legend in the neighborhood, a tale of arrogance challenged and humility restored. Karen's name became synonymous with cautionary tales, and the HOA learned to respect property rights and the limits of authority. I, meanwhile, enjoyed my home in peace, with the knowledge that the fight had been worth it, and that patience, research, and courage had restored not only the lake house, but also my sense of security and serenity. The lake house, standing proudly by the water, reflected the sunlight like a jewel in the hands of history. It was mine, fully and absolutely, and the serenity I'd sought when I first purchased it had been restored beyond anything I had imagined. The echoes of Karen's arrogance faded with time, and the house continued to whisper stories of resilience, strength, and justice for anyone who listened carefully. Every morning, as I walked along the shoreline, the lake shimmering in golden light, I knew that I had not only won a property dispute, but had claimed peace, dignity, and triumph over arrogance. The lesson was clear. Even in victory, kindness and integrity could prevail, and even the most relentless opposition could be overcome with patience and clarity. The lake house was no longer just a dream. It was a living symbol of justice fulfilled and history respected, a 100-year-old testament to the power of persistence and the reward that comes to those who dare to stand their ground.